Hey, hello everybody. This is Keijsers Koning YouTube channel where we do conduct interviews with artists who are showing at the gallery currently. And we have Kris Pierce here with his exhibit Applause, which opened on February 17th and will be on view until March 23rd, 2024. Kris is from the DFW region, currently lives in Fort Worth, and has exhibited internationally and nationally throughout various museums, from the Dallas Museum of Art to the Akron Art Museum to Crystal Bridge Museum of America, and even in Hiroshima Art Center in Japan, just to name a few. And the exhibit that we have on view now, Applause, what's really interesting about it and what we really try to do is to show the variety of narrative that Kris has achieved. So we're going to be discussing some of his paintings. We're going to be discussing some of the video works, the sculptural aspects, and it's really an exciting show just because it touches on all these different parts, but you can really see the thread that goes throughout it. And we're going to talk a little bit about Kris's motivation, Kris's also ability to bring in nostalgia or historic elements or vintage, whichever you want to name it, and the contemporary and how it applies to us right at this very moment. So without further ado, Kris, you say hi.
Hi, thanks for setting this up.
Absolutely. So I really appreciate you doing the show. I think it's a lot of fun that we see here, and at the same time, you're tackling a bunch of subjects that are weighing on us at this very moment. And I think we can see that the element of pop color is very much present. But we also see these kind of quirky figures throughout it, these cartoon forms that are almost archaic, kind of flat representation of the men or the modern men, as we'll get into that discussion. And at the same time, the influence is, of course, very contemporary, as well as because you're using elements of AI, which we'll also get into. I think the great piece to start with is actually the work titled Mirror Carousel, which is 81 by 60 inches. Kris, do you want to tell us a little bit about the process of how this piece was built, so to speak?
Yeah, for sure. So I think I would consider this like probably an anchor work in the show, in that there's a number of different ways that it relates to other paintings and works in the show. Um, the source image that actually is utilized that you see like in the background is a tapestry that was done by Le Corbusier, who is, for those of you who don't know, is like a really prolific designer, artist, a sort of a man of many talents throughout like the early 20th century. Um, but really, what that tapestry was depicting in its original form was a group of female musicians abstracted, playing instruments, and it's really trying to capture the aesthetic of like modernist America, of not necessarily America, but the modernist in general, globally at least, like from a Western perspective. Um, and using that as an equivalency to what I've sort of integrated into the work and integrate into a lot of my work, which is these, for lack of a better term, like naughty businessman characters that come out of these blue comic books of like the 1950s. So I think like as an artist, as an individual, I'm interested in these systems of power. A lot of times those systems of power exist in contemporary times through things like technology, but part of what I try to do as an artist is find intersections between what's contemporary in that regard and what systems of power were at play that are equivalency throughout history. So in this particular work and in this particular show, with a lot of the larger body of work that I've been making for the past 5 years, it's taking this idea of the businessman, or this sort of token um, American idealist character that was perpetuated throughout the 50s, and sort of placing them in situations where we can look at them and really evaluate like their coded history, where what that was at the time, and where that's sort of evolved and how it exists in contemporary times. So this work, to be a little bit formalist about it, it's that original Le Corbusier tapestry, but flipped. It's a mirror version of it. Um, and these characters that are extracted from these blue, I guess, like more naughty comic books than what you would find in like a kids comic book collection, are really like infiltrating or like invading the space. So they're the ones behind the curtain that are invading it. Um, I did start to integrate a lot of 3D elements into paintings over the past few years. So this token of affirmation, which comes from a like a vintage button that says "I love me" at the bottom, is actually a 3D element that's painted on birch that's integrated into the painting. So I think this really just like sets up the larger idea of the exhibition. And then this image is actually used as source material for generating additional and completely new generative modernist works that are integrated into several other paintings in the exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, I you hit on quite a few things, of course, but I think the idea of this modernism, especially by Le Corbusier, was also taken with a point of view of male, mainly male, and the male gaze, the male dominance, and out of the 40s and 50s. Yet, what I think is also interesting and something you've also been confronted with yourself in the sense of working a lot in the computer world, etc., through your animation background, is this kind of technology bro culture, which is very similar of, this superimposing opinion of like, oh, I'll solve this. We can do this easily. And I think that was very present also with at the time with Le Corbusier and the architects that were creating these worlds. And what I
Y-
find so interesting also in your work is that the flat compositions, you're picking these very stereotypical cartoon figurations, which either had men as doofuses or as these non-communicative forces of power. And you're collaging them. I mean, that's just to be clear, in this image that we're looking at, a mirror carousel, these are all painted elements except for the "I love me," which is a superimposed shape, um, which is also painted. But it all of these are layered, and the shadows are trompe-l'oeil. So it's kind of interesting how you're layering the flatness of these figures and to create depth that where there actually is no depth, so to speak. Um, and while you were talking about flipping, the interesting part, so there's a big piece in the show, which is right behind me there, which is Pepper's Ghost, and it's a mirror, and it actually shows the piece flipped. And that is the version that is of Le Corbusier's tapestry in the MoMA, correct?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, and the right way, the right.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Right.
And I kind of like this the playfulness also in the exhibit of people becoming part of these layers. By standing in front of the mirror, you're seeing a reflection of yourself. You're also in the painting. There's no escaping your presence within it. I really appreciate that, especially with pages where we usually can and or take some distance from it and allow ourselves to not necessarily be inside, or we can choose not to. You're actually really putting us
Yeah,
in a fun way, like not you're not forcing it, but you're kind of like, see, you're here, you're there. uh
right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add to that that I think that there's like a number of different layers that I'm interested in working in. So like you mentioned this idea of like space within the composition, there being like two-dimensional space, but also 3D space that's integrated into it. So there's like a friction or interplay between those different layers of space. Well, the way that you talk about the mirror and it's sort of like that bringing yourself into it, I think of that as like integrating time into it. So one thing that I find interesting about using a sort of like vintage imagery or imagery that's very like evocative of an era is that because it's evocative of a specific era, you feel or you're required to bring your own bias, opinions, perspective into the work, as opposed to if it was something um, completely new or contemporary feeling. And I think that that's just another interesting way, at least for me, to place the viewer into the work, because they're required to connect the dots inside their brain, or maybe it happens on some subconscious level where this is something of a different era. They're required to do a additional layer of work to sort of tease out like, well, what does that mean? What biases am I bringing into that conversation? I think that's just another way that I try to work not across like space, formal space, but also like time, memory, and things like that.
Well, and you cover multiple layers of time. I mean, like I just pulled up a Shucks, which is a acrylic on enamel on canvas, 51 by 54 inches. And here we see these kind of scratch and sniff stickers that were very popular in the 70s and 80s. I think more 80s actually. And you would get them as approval, or if you stuck around long enough in a grocery store and you were a good kid, you know, you would get these scratch things. And it's interesting that that gets you into this whole nother generation of connecting and being present in, and being able to identify. And it's also funny because the cartoons are kind of like our fathers. Then we get into
Mhm.
our actual youth, and now, well, now we're old. So yeah, you created the cycle of life, but it's an interesting entrance point of various stages and levels of age as well, which is kind of
Y-
an intriguing
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's, the idea of like collapsing these different generations and aesthetics into like a single work
yeah.
is something that like I'm very conscious and specific about doing. Because I think when you do that, you start to connect the dots and see these sort of commonalities. And I think just to kind of um, unpack the idea of like the show a little bit, the word, applause is used really as um, relating to this idea of affirmation. And affirmation is something that just exists in every single work across the entire exhibition. And at least for me, when I think of affirmation, I think of that in regards to the systems of power. I mean, there's very specific things that you can point to in contemporary society, such as like social media, where it likes, shares,
Yeah,
follows,
exactly.
things like that are very overt affirmations,
No.
but those affirmations drive value across what is like undoubtedly the most powerful medium or powerful tool of communication in society today. So it's taking that idea and kicking it back to previous generations and looking at how affirmation is used to drive power across decades and across time.
Well, who knew that, a like button had so much power? I mean, it's just it's actually stunning, an influence.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's also what you kind of play on also, and there's a lineage to it, funnily enough, which I didn't even think about, because now we associate it with things like Instagram, where we're like, okay, we want so many wants and likes. But we've always had that, when if we look, always, but well, actually, yes. But if you look at a piece like Pepper's Ghost, where we see all these kind of confirmations that used to be expressed in buttons that you would put on your jacket, and that's how you were identified, or you would, you were like, okay, I'm this team and that team, but it was also this way to be liked, or the way to be appreciated, um, positive or negative. And I mean, this piece is just, it's so much fun. And I also mean, when people walk in, you've got this your own
Mhm.
reflection, which of course, attracts us. Always the part that attracts you, and then you start kind of identifying which part are you of that piece. And then I love that connection that you constantly have with it, and how interactive it is and conceptually, which is kind of interesting. It's this, you know, your own choices, and again, your own likes, and the way we can
Right.
point at it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I would add, like, specifically with this work is, you know, what I was talking about earlier, where you have to sort of place yourself and your own biases um, in the work to be able to unpack like the history of this type of imagery or whatever it is that you're sort of bringing to the work.
Uh,
This is just a more literal way of doing that. So, you know, the mirror really just amplifies space in a way that nothing else could. It places you in the work and in a very, very literal way. And the actual proportions of the mirror are, you know, very specific. Of course, it's meant to be human scale, so that you can walk up on it. It's ground level, so that you can see, you know, your entire figure. And it's at a height that is a standard height for um, a literal vanity mirror, which is 84 inches. So those sort of proportions and scale, and that sort of um, conceptual element to placing your work and experiencing the work in a different way through a reflection is it's very like specific in the intention of how I made it.
yeah, but when you say literal, it's funny because the engagement of it is I'm talking about on a audience engagement,
Hmm.
is kind of throws you off guard, which is kind of funny. It's yes, it's literal because you got these components that are there, but because there becomes this reflection, there is this full body encounter. It's not just the face or part of the body, it's this full immersion. And it, it catches people off guard, which is kind of funny. And it catches people into it and puts them into a different way of acting and thinking, which gets into subtly get the work all of a sudden becomes subtle, which is kind of funny that it is that nuanced. Even though, like you said, it's very literal. You know, the parts are there. This is me. That's me. I'm not a good listener. I am a good listener. Or, you know,
Hmm.
in me, etc. Um, I
And
sorry.
oh, go ahead. You go ahead.
No, I just think that that is kind of an interesting way of your about your work, is that I think you get caught into it, and not components may not always work for you, but you understand them or you engage with them
Mhm.
at a very subconscious level. I think
Yeah.
it's one of these things where you walk away from it and you kind of go, "Oh, hang on, what was that? Hang on," you know, because it like triggers all these other memories
Right.
and
And
concepts.
I think one additional kind of thing with this work in particular is like the idea of a mirror, like sort of a mirror in a spectacular setting that has this sort of photographic draw to it.
Yeah,
It's just another way to, again, like collapse these different things into a singular environment, because I feel like it also invites people to like photograph themselves, like view themselves. Like that work was heavily photographed, like at the opening and when people visit. And I think those photographs in turn start to become part of this ecosystem of technology where a lot of this stuff is relevant today when it becomes uploaded and it becomes liked, and then it's just this like self-perpetuating cycle. So having something that could deliver itself outside of the gallery environment and into that digital space was very like intentional on my part. And what better way to do that than like a mirror, um, because you know the idea
it's
of
an
like
interesting way for your own work to get its own information, right? With
right,
they getting posted and seeing how many likes. We should actually
exactly.
like that, you know, seeing how good the work is according to the clicks. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these elements that we see throughout the paintings, and how they are or were generated, not generated, but influenced. And I'm speaking of mainly the AI component that you're using. So you have a background, of course, in computers and animations, but AI is relatively new, and especially in image making. And I'm specifically here pulled up Yay because well, why don't you explain it?
Yeah, yeah.
It's painting within a painting. There's a figure and holding a painting up. But please.
Right. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, the source image inside of Mirror Carousel was used to generate a number of additional modernist, or at least modernist through the lens of AI, generated work, which was then repainted or illustrated into both this work and then the other painting, Data Miner. So I think that the interesting thing about it is like, back to this idea of systems, is once you start to use a system to generate uh, an image or a work, you're beholden to that system in one way or another. So it's bringing its own biases into it. It's bringing its own decision making into it. Of course, it gets filtered once it spits it out. But I think that, the interesting thing about it is it starts to surface that system in a number of different ways when you start to ask it to like replicate a source image. Um, that being in that the byproduct is really the byproduct of a number of different inputs. So your input's not specifically going to be the source material that I fed it, but it's going to be all of the inputs that were used to train the model. So that becomes interesting, telling in its own ways because you have artists like Stuart Davis that are obviously represented. You even had have contemporary artists like Rodney Graham that did, sort of his own versions of modernist paintings that start to be represented. These things, if you have an understanding of art history or modernist painting, you start to see how these things surface over time in through these models of these AI models and stuff like that. And I think that's just another interesting way to reveal the man behind the curtain, not to be too literal, but as with Mirror Carousel, you have sort of the men behind the tapestry, the men behind the curtain. This is very much a way to reveal that hand of influence that's generating and outputting these things that we may have a different read on. So it's really about highlighting that.
Well,
Um,
also highlights on something else, which is, AI is a tool, and clearly that tool has its faults. I mean, you still need to use your own interpretation. If asking an AI to give you an interpretation of a Le Corbusier painting, and it ends up giving you a Stuart Davis just because it's the same time era, and it's kind of interesting that uh,
mhm.
we still need to filter through it ourselves, and it's a it's something that we can use to jumpstart something, but it's never a guiding force, which I guess that's partially our hope, that we haven't been overtaken quite yet. Um, and then one of the things that I would like to, I mean, two things I would like to just more technically what we're looking at bring about, which is with data miner, of course, we see these fields that are being divided, but we're actually again see these components like in the right hand corner with I have seen the future. That is it's a 3D element that's being reintroduced. And then we have the bear that is actually sleeping or chuckling in the corner that is actually painted. On the Yay painting, we have a couple of components. We have the figure behind a painting that was I believe he gave the instructions to AI to generate a Le Corbusier inspired painting with these components, and this is kind of what popped out, which these colors are never used by him. But and then you superimpose the letters yay, Y-A, Y with an exclamation mark in neon. And I love these chords that it comes straight down. You don't shy away from just pointing out what things are, but at the same time, it creates a mystery, and you wonder like, what's going on? What is this world? It's so funny. You're so literal, and you're kind of pointing like, this is it, this is it, this is it, and then your brain's just kind of like, yeah, but why am I standing here? Why am I in this mind frame? And I think that kind of, I don't want to say surrealistic, but that kind of dreamscape or that other world that you kind of introduce, even though you're very blunt about where you are. I always feel with your work that I'm in another hemisphere or another location. And then so I would like to talk a little bit about Cosmic Rerun, because I think that is a piece. So let me just pull that up. So I'll just describe it technically. So what we're looking at are you built a speaker, you built a top casket, almost like a musician setup of amps. However, it's a screen that's generating imagery, which we'll get into a little bit, but it's a screen that the front is painted with cartoon figures. The back and the is fully opened, as is the top. We can see here the image as well, and in the back showcases the wiring and the components that are required to make this run, and also the speakers we see. Kris built all of this himself, and it's just stunning the amount of details that are there, and the care for each of every single inch. And the imagery of the film. So there's a couple of components I just want to touch on, and I'll let you speak about it in a minute, but is that it's your animation and then combined with found footage of 1960s hippie culture, which was a kind of seismic shift in America, even though the hippie culture was very patriarchal, even though, and everybody was saying like, oh, this is bringing people together, but it was mainly being led by men, and it was ideally for men, which I always find kind of interesting about that revolution, quote unquote. But Kris, could you lead us a little bit about how you built this, what some of the video components, how you got there, writing yourself, if you could explore that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think of course I have natural aesthetics I'm drawn to that will come from my past. And a lot of that stuff will make it into the work. So I mean, as you know, like I played in bands and was a musician. I mean, still am since I was 13 years old. So that's very much a part of like my visual culture and what interests me. So I think a lot of that will end up making its way into the work. So whether it's like fabricating speaker cabinets or things that come out of the aesthetic of arcade machines, a lot of those things you'll see in a number of different sculptures that I've made and will continue to make. So, you know, the pseudo arcade bezel that gets integrated along with buttons or things that have a very tactile nature to it, I think help to create this sense of touch or this sense of wanting to touch, because in I guess a standard setting, these types of things would exist as like utilitarian components. So the speaker is to be played, the button is to be played with, the cord is to be, plugged in and has a very specific utilitarian use. But at least for me, I think it's interesting to include those things in work and in a context to where they're not technically able to be played with. So that's creating interesting tension between the work and between the viewer. So from a formal perspective, I think that that's where a lot of my aesthetic comes from. And that's why, like, at least conceptually, I tend to like integrate into the work in that manner. The same with lights, lights, buttons, sound, texture, these things create that friction of touch. And that's a very different experience in a gallery as opposed to if it was something that was in a commercial setting or whatnot. Um, when it comes to the video, yes, as you mentioned, I have a long history of working in animation in a number of different ways. But really, the content of that video comes from this idea, this main character idea, the character being present throughout a lot of the work in the show, being this sort of businessman character. There's also a number of different ways that that manifests and that I'm interested in exploring. So the artist is one of them. But in this specific work, it's this idea of like the guru and how that plugs into, which was very much a reaction to the Mad Men era type of characters you would see, a reaction to that through like the 60s. Um, that being said, this idea of like the guru character that takes you through like a number of different vignettes in the video is presented as being like very innocent, brings its own like baggage and difficulty in regards to how it pays off the promises that it makes, the promise of the love generation. Like, how did that ultimately pay off? What did that end up evolving into, good and bad? How does that relate to where we are today? What are some equivalencies to it? And one of the methodologies that I use when creating these videos, in this video in particular, is this idea of like the mixtape. So the mixtape being something traditionally that you would make to communicate your love or affection to someone that maybe wasn't like picking up on it, or that you were too shy to share. I use that same approach to string together very specific pieces of content that do the same thing. They're meant to like communicate this idea of evolution of self and identity in that specific moment of time, and look at how it like evolves through lyrics and image, and all in the context of sculpture.
Well, it's also interesting, actually. It's again about that affirmation. It's like playing a certain song you want to be heard or seen for that
Yeah,
matter. Um, and I will say also the buttons on these types of sculptures. I mean, that it's so fascinating. It's what drives you as an audience member to kind of you feel you want to push, you want to engage, and of course you see people do it, and in um the reward there is none. It's kind of so it's
right.
just funny, like push pull of like please touch me, and then when you are touched, nothing happens. So it's kind of a poor reward system in that matter. But what I do find the audience is very engaged in and gets fully sucked into it. And again, I think it's also because of that approachability of the non-threatening imagery, the kind of vintage, but also soften. I guess nostalgic, it pulls you in, but then you kind of puncture that thought process with the text that you've written. Um, but I think throughout your work that's actually kind of what's happening. And I think quite a few people are when they leave the exhibit, what I like so much is that they keep thinking about it, even subconsciously, just like, hang on, what space was I really in? Where was I? Because there wasn't just a 1950s cartoon. It wasn't just that type of
Right.
dialogue that you can point back and be like, oh, okay, yeah, that was messed up back then. But it's like, no, hang on, we still are having these conversations. we haven't evolved as much or as quick as we had hoped. Um, and those, I think I think you actually point out traps um, of roles that people can fall into, which I kind of find intriguing. You know, it's
Mhm.
this pattern of behavior that you're, I guess you're questioning, or you know, because this is not, and I want to be clear, we're talking very much of like, okay, about certain subject matters, but the show is not finger pointing. It's not like wagging and just like, oh, I know it better.
Yeah,
It's much more an exploration of certain facts and how we as a viewer kind of feel towards it. I mean, you certainly have your opinions and feelings about it, but I think what's so intriguing is that your work wonders about it much more. Like it's also kind of like these were the facts. These are the things that
right.
influence me. Bad, good,
Well,
whatever, you know.
yeah, and I think it's always really important for me to not bring cynicism into the work because I feel like cynicism squashes the element of possibility, which I always like to maintain. I think that that's very decisive. So I like to leave things open, but in regards to the way that things repeat over time, for me, a lot of the work is this idea about individualism and individualism as a core tenet of American identity. So that, in contrast to maybe more collectivist cultures, community-based cultures, the United States is a very individualist-based society, and I think you really feel that in a like a very unique way if you're in Texas. Texas is fiercely individualistic, at least on the surface in some way. But I think this idea of individualism has perpetuated American culture throughout its founding. You can look at a number of different ways that that's manifested. I mean, this idea of going west to stake your claim, to claim territory, to be the hero. Those things are all based around individual perspective of the world. And I think that that's very specific. It has a very specific flavor in American culture, and that's something that I try to tap into, and I constantly am referring back to this as an idea or a mode of thinking whenever I'm working on anything.
Yeah, but and it's funny you say that because you know that hero complex. I mean, that's something that we still see to this day, whether it be this kind of push to get arrows get out to space and be the hero there type of
Hmm.
behavior to um these factors of cosplay and and all that like um imagining yourself as something other than and
Yeah.
escape yourself. But I do find as individual as people praise it to be, and they do praise the individual, it's always generated within a community, which I find kind of interesting, that push and pull, if it's
Yeah.
America is very much aware of its sense of unity. Okay, maybe not now, but in general, we're speaking general terms here, but and kind of that pulling together. So I find that kind of interesting, and I think also pulling it back to your work to not get too philosophical about the whole gender is that you pick on these moments that everybody can identify with, and hence the story becomes possible to be threaded through. Um, and that's from going to something as innocent as scratch and sniff to 50s cartoons to currently using AI and kind of that push of utopia. I mean, I
Hmm.
do think that that's very fascinating. Something we didn't really touch on is which is very present in Cosmic Rerun, the video sculpture, is this ideal pursuit of utopia. And I believe also in the landscaping, you had asked AI to generate a notion of utopic landscapes. Like, what does this look like? What does it do? And it creates some weird moments, I will say. And you'll have to sit through the video, and you'll see all of some of these dark splotches come out, and you're like, oh shit, what's this? You know, it's kind of like it's never good enough. So, which is an interesting reminder that even you know, programs tell us such. Do you think at all about utopia? I guess that's something you and I spoke of.
Yeah, I think yeah, as you mentioned, yeah, there's a number of different like interstitials that exist in this particular work where it was AI prompted video to generate like a utopian vision of like the world or the landscape or a country or something like that. And as you mentioned, you get very like interesting results. But I think that utopia idea really relates to this dynamic between the individual and the sort of collective idea of society, because in order to have a utopia, you have to you know, yeah, you have to like has to integrate and vibe with the other people in
Yeah.
society. So it's just like an interesting conflict that exists to where, you know, people are always striving towards achieving these things, or maybe there's segments of pop culture or you know, micro communities that have really worked towards building a utopia. Well, that always becomes wrapped up in this idea or a cult of personality, which is very much tied to this individualist tendencies of either society, Western society, or even just inherently human tendencies. So that tension and conflict that exists, I think, is an interesting way to plug the idea of utopia into these cult of personality figures that you see permeate a lot of the work that I make.
It's almost like, where do we want to be? You know, and I like that the work doesn't necessarily have an answer for me. Helps me wonder. It's like, yeah, where do we want to go? Do we just, and again, it's not the good or the bad, but it's kind of an awareness. I guess it's all just a balancing act. You know, it's we need a
Right.
bit of both. We need a little bit of both of this consensus, even with people we don't like, which, you know, is tough. But listen, I just wanted to really thank you for taking your time to talk to me about the show. And I, you know, I really am intrigued, and I about how people are interacting and what people are walking away with. And I really appreciate that about your work, and the various levels that one can interact with it. You know, the appreciation of just immediacy to these kind of philosophical quests that we kind of wander away with. And I really wanted to literally applaud that in your work. Sorry, that was a bit of a pun, but anyway, the
Thank you.
yeah, I really appreciate the show, and I really want to thank you for doing it at the space. So I won't take up more of your time, but again, the show is up until March 23rd in 2024, and we'll look forward to having you at the gallery. Thanks, Kris.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
All
Bye.
right. Bye-bye.